Bitcoin is just a superior way to store value compared to everything else.
Before maybe we can start with all the topics, give the people and the listeners some background of like who you are and most importantly why you're excited about Bitcoin.
Yeah, absolutely. So I studied mechanical engineering in college, ultimately graduated with a business degree. Then I went straight into Oracle selling enterprise software for about 4 years. Thought my life was, leading up to that moment, I thought that was who I was, my identity. And I quickly found that although the career stuff was going well, I wanted more out of life. I just couldn't see myself sitting in that chair every day, every year. And so I went through a yoga teacher training. I started experimenting with psychedelics, started reading a lot, and ultimately left the budding career at Oracle. And my girlfriend at the time, now wife, sold everything we owned and we bought a one-way ticket to India. This was back in 2014. And then we traveled for about 5 years working remotely and building online businesses. Digital nomading started to become popular in recent years, and we were kind of doing that. So just set up shop around the world, rent an apartment for a few months, work there, do whatever is cool to do in that local country. And towards the tail end of that nomadic period, discovered Bitcoin. This was in 2017. Like most people, bumped into it a few times prior, but 2017 is when it stuck. And also, like most people, number go up is what got me interested, actually interested. And so I traded all the shit coins in 2017, thought I was an absolute genius, then lost all those gains more or less in 2018. And then first half of 2018 is when I did the proper deep dive into Bitcoin, taught myself economics from the ground up, read all the books, just obsessive studying. And out of that obsessive period, I realized that Bitcoin actually was the thing here and that blockchains are not necessarily general purpose technology, and sort of starting then focused all energy on Bitcoin. And then did all kinds of random stuff in the industry when I knew I wanted to make a career change. And I had a consulting shop. I was selling products for other people in the industry. Ultimately met Corey Clipston, the CEO of Swan, at a Bitcoin conference in San Francisco in 2019. And then later that year joined Swan and have been there for 5.5 years now. Very proud of what we built. Before joining Swan, I started reading about Bitcoin and writing about Bitcoin, like I said. And I published an essay exploring Bitcoin through the lens of mycology, or the study of fungi, which I just had a personal interest in for about a decade prior to finding Bitcoin. And I noticed the similarities between Bitcoin as a decentralized type of organism that lives online. And anyway, started publishing essays on that. And to my surprise, the Bitcoin community was very interested in those essays. And so I kind of became known as the Bitcoin mushroom guy during that era. And side note, I actually long for that era of Bitcoin Twitter when the content was more philosophical, the community was a little more focused. And, since then, let's say 5 years later, the content is much, or 7 years later now. Wow, that's crazy. The discussion is very different. It's clear that Bitcoin is becoming financialized. And so the community started fracturing into different groups. I don't view this necessarily as a bad thing. I view this as a necessary step towards Bitcoin's ultimate takeover. And so I long for it in the personal sense because I liked the discussions more back then, but this is good for Bitcoin and there's nothing we can do to stop it. And so, yeah, that's more or less where we are today. I think you also asked why I like Bitcoin, and I definitely have a libertarian perspective on the world. And so what drew me initially was the personal sovereignty side and the ability to create a monetary system that's not controlled by any central actor or group of actors. And so I view it as a tool to liberate humanity from centralized money printing. And I think the downstream effects of having a market-based solution to money is enormous. And I think it will take a long time to unwind the issues we've created from having a fiat-based system for so long. But I'm here for that ride, and we're already starting to see the benefits all over the world. And so I could not be more bullish or excited about the industry.
It's super interesting, and this core ethos is kind of also the main thing on Bitcoin, but it's kind of, I think that's what a lot of people also criticize on like the treasury companies and like this simping to politicians, where is that why we're actually in Bitcoin? Is that the core ethos of Bitcoin? Is that the freedom thing? And you also said you're writing essays currently. I think you mentioned also treasury companies. Is that the angle you're taking it, or like how do you approach that topic?
Yeah, I think it's a pretty obvious rift in the community right now, which is that earlier ideological Bitcoiners would say, "Hey, I got into this thing to skip the banks. I got in this thing to not have to listen to what the government says." Right? And I totally empathize with that point of view. That's how I came into Bitcoin. I still believe that that's mostly true. However, once Bitcoin's large enough, it's going to garner the attention of the powers that be. And there's nothing we can do about that. And so I think I would rather have some percentage of Bitcoiners working directly with the state and the banking system, financial system, so that we can ensure that our voice is heard, right? If we don't pay attention to Bitcoin and we just let the politicians do whatever they want, I would see high risk that the politicians steer the policy decisions in a way that harms Bitcoiners and potentially Bitcoin. And so I'm very happy about places or firms like the Bitcoin Policy Institute. We have proper Bitcoiners in DC advocating for our community. And so I think that it's a necessary step. In terms of the financialization side, I really don't empathize with this view. I think it's just a ideological point of view divorced from reality. And what I mean is, if Bitcoin really is the best monetary asset of all time, which I certainly believe, then of course governments and corporations are going to adopt this thing. And so I don't really see it as turning our backs on the original ideology. I see this as a necessary step towards $100 trillion market cap and Bitcoin being base money. And so I think it's inevitable. It's a sign that we're winning, but it doesn't mean we should just sacrifice our principles to the altar of NGU, right? So we still need to be vigilant. We still need to be working towards the cypherpunk future that we desire. And so I see that coming up in a much smaller percentage of the Bitcoin community today, but I think that ethos is still alive. And yeah, of course, NGU blinds people. So there will be people who do sacrifice the principles for NGU. And it's on us as a community to stay vigilant and self police those things and make sure we don't just all get rich and lose the potential we have here, which is separating money from state.
It's a natural progression, I think. It's so funny if we want to throw, if we really want to throw off the traditional financial system, of course we first have to kind of get all those things in place. It's not like that there's the fiat system and there's the Bitcoin system, and then one day we are switching that off and like just having Bitcoin rails and like no stable coins, no fiat, no credit system, nothing like that, just like Bitcoin. I think that will probably never happen, or like in the very far future, because there will always be some credit systems, like people will always like borrow against like those financial instruments are very natural even in the free market without money printer. So yeah, it's a very natural progression, but I, I feel that because it can feel frustrating if you're coming here for to throw over the government, and then we're simping to like Donald Trump being at the at the Bitcoin conference. So like, I see that point, but it's like if you're complaining that Bitcoin is winning, like that's just that feels weird. 100 trillion just seems slow to me when you mentioned that seems bearish.
Yeah, I think it is a little bearish, but you start saying larger numbers than that, and people think you're absolutely nuts. Uh, One more point on ideology. So we had a similar situation with medium of exchange versus store of value and sort of the order of operations for how a monetary asset becomes monetized. And early on in Bitcoin's history, there was this false, misguided belief, we might say, that Bitcoin is for payments. And the first thing we need to do is just start buying things with Bitcoin because Bitcoin's cheaper and faster than the fiat payment systems. And that was never true, except maybe in the very beginning when no blocks are filled. And, you know, yeah, you might make an argument. But I think that that argument was wrong. And as soon as people started paying with Bitcoin, they realized they have an accounting headache, they have a tax headache. And so there's really not natural incentives in the West to use Bitcoin in payments today. Now, if you're in a developing country with a horrible currency and fragmented payment networks, yeah, sure, there's a marginal improvement for you in that world. But the real game here is the world needs to identify Bitcoin as a store of value asset first. And once it's widely held, widely distributed, and as a function of adoption, volatility goes down, then you're setting the stages for Bitcoin to potentially be used as a wide stream payment method of payment. And so it's really order of operations: store value first, then medium of exchange, and if we get there, unit of account at some point. And I think we will price the world in Bitcoin at some point. I think that's natural that we'll get to that. But to your other point, it will take a very long time. And yes, I do expect governments to hold on to their monetary printer because that's a massive source of power. Now, where Bitcoin plays a role here is it would create a model here where if the government prints too much money, their citizens have a way out. So they can vote with their dollar and shift their asset allocation out of US treasuries or dollars or US equities and put them into Bitcoin. And that acts as a restraint on excessive money printing. And I think that's all we really can hope for in this world. And I think that that is enough, right? It gives people choice, and choice is enough to push back on excessive money printing. And that can create a world for everyone to be successful, because store your wealth in Bitcoin, fine if you have to use the payment system of the state. And if you really need to make payments outside the state's purview, I sincerely hope we have cypherpunk tools to allow this at scale.
I'm always surprised how fast we're going. I'm like, if I look at the Bitcoin development, like I came in 2020 and I kind of made a plan for me, like, oh, how do I see this shaking out? And I was way too conservative. I've not like not at all had it on my bingo card that America will have a president that is actively speaking with the Bitcoin community and is on conference. Like that just blew me out of the way. Even El Salvador, like having a state that, yeah, they are very small, like in the grand scheme of things, like they're like tiny when you compare it to like America or like the world forces, but them already buying Bitcoin, embracing it as a medium of exchange. How was it for you to see those changes and how fast we are already? We're just 16 years in. Like Bitcoin Bitcoin is still like a teenager. How do you look at the fast development?
Yeah, I agree. I think I'm as bullish as I possibly can be on Bitcoin over the long term, but I did not see the states embracing Bitcoin occurring this quickly. I was expecting that to be more out of desperation, and instead it looks like the current administration is adopting Bitcoin out of opportunity in a positive sense. And what does this mean for Bitcoin as a market? Well, fast or rewind 5 years, let's say 2020. I would say the biggest risk to Bitcoin then was the state fighting back. Hey, we're going to lose the monopoly on money printing. We need to attack this thing, or let's neuter this thing. And instead, the US government did a 180 and they're leaning in as hard as you could possibly imagine. And so the biggest risk to Bitcoin just became a tailwind in just a few short years. And I think that de-risking moment of seeing the US government lean in is massively bullish, and it pulls the timeline forward dramatically, because at a almost $2.5 trillion asset, in order to pump this thing up to a 20 trillion, $200 trillion asset, we need larger and larger pools of capital. It's not going to come from retail buying $50 a week. And so de-risking it at the state level makes way for enormous pools of capital to try and capture some of this upside. And that's what we're seeing. Now, it will
I
still take time, right, to build those bridges or build those tubes to pour the capital in, but we're already seeing it happening now. And I do think the treasury companies are the next step in that mission, right? You're allowing different pools of capital to get a piece and buying in an equity format. And Yeah, there's pros and cons to that approach, but I think we're going to continually see new pipes bolted onto the Bitcoin thing, so big capital can flow.
I also checked out your website, even if you just scroll through your articles on your essays that you're writing, I love how you phrase that Bitcoin is a pioneer species. That sounds really interesting. What do you mean? What do you mean? And also see what you meant before with the mushroom, the Bitcoin mushroom thing. So I just want to show this to people. I think there's some interesting reads out there, and there are some interesting opinions out there. But like, what do you mean with like pioneer species? I haven't read the article to be
Yeah,
frank.
no problem. Happy to explain. So, in ecology, there's a type of organism that is called the pioneer species. And what a pioneer species does is it colonizes uh, desolate landscapes, and it's kind of the first organism to convert, let's say, a barren rock or an island in the middle of the ocean. How does that become something more than just a dead rock in the ocean? Right? The pioneer species colonize that dead rock. It could be a seed dropped from birds pooping on the island. It could be plants that drift and land ashore, many other ways. And the classic example is a lichen. So a lichen is a symbiosis between a plant and a fungus, and that would colonize that rock. The fungal organism essentially uses chemistry to digest the rock. It breaks down the rock and liberates useful minerals out of the rock. And the plant uses photosynthesis to create energy from the sun. So those two work together and they digest a barren rock and they start to create soil. And as that rock breaks down, other organisms are then able to live there as well. And so it kicks off a process of ecological succession, bringing waves of more complex life to that dead rock in the ocean. And over the long scale, that dead rock becomes a thriving ecosystem. And it's all because that one pioneer species kicked off that process. And I use that analogy to explain Bitcoin mining, right? A lot of people think about Bitcoin mining as just plugging into the grid, find cheap energy, mine some Bitcoin. But what also happens in Bitcoin mining is Bitcoin miners serve as an incentive to go deploy new energy assets. And so if you look at the Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo, that's the famous case study. There's a mountainous region with a national park, tons of hydro potential, and very poor people living nearby, and they don't have very much energy. And they don't have the capital to go put this huge hydro facility there, and they don't have the capital to run that high voltage transmission down to the population centers either. So they're kind of stuck without energy. So the Bitcoin miners come in and they're the first customer of that energy asset. They're the anchor tenant. And what that leads to from an incentive standpoint is it becomes easier to get financing to deploy new energy generation assets because the Bitcoin miners are there day one buying all that energy. So your ROI on the energy asset is much better, and the capital that would be deployed is de-risked. So it essentially creates an incentive for new energy generation all around the world, which is what happened in the Congo. They dropped shipping containers, dammed up some rivers. Now they're sending power through the region. And it wouldn't have been possible without Bitcoin miners serving as that pioneer species. And as soon as you have energy in a location, what happens? Then you can create industry. Then now there's new energy, they can go build stuff. And if you're building stuff with a factory, you're going to need people to live nearby. Those people need a place to live, they need food, they need services. So you drop a little energy asset and human prosperity flourishes around that energy asset because energy is upstream of all human flourishing. And so that's similar to ecological succession. And if we go back to that lichen on the dead rock in the middle of the ocean, as soon as that ecosystem becomes mature, that lichen no longer serves a purpose and more complex life crowds it out. And then hopefully that organism reproduces and then it goes and finds a new desolate landscape to colonize. And so it's a constant process of rehabilitating landscapes and building complexity in life. And Bitcoin miners, as soon as that energy asset is mature and the customers arrive, the miners aren't profitable anymore. So they take those machines and then they go seed a new energy asset and they go buy energy elsewhere, kicking off the same process. So we're seeing little isolated energy pockets popping up all around the world. Wherever they go, human flourishing follows.
That's an amazing comparison with Bitcoin mining. It's it kind of makes me wonder what will happen to the overall world order once we have Bitcoin mining, canning, being able to facilitate those regions with more power and with more energy. How do you think about like the global world order where we now have like America and Europe and like maybe China, but then there's like also Africa and India, especially you've been to India as you said. How do you look at this globalization of like having one money thing, but also with Bitcoin mining being able to kind of give a region that is kind of dead do a new life with Bitcoin mining?
Yeah, I think there's two parts to the question. So, what happens if we distribute more energy around the world? And what happens if we have a global money? How does that impact international development? So, first on energy, as I said, energy is upstream of all human flourishing. So, if you want to have a successful country, you need to have a lot of energy. And if you have a lot of energy, you can produce things locally instead of relying on foreign imports, which are more expensive. And if you have a lot of energy, you have jobs locally as well. So simply having energy is required. And if you want to have any sort of modern conveniences, if you want to protect yourself from heat or cold, if you want to have hospitals, if you want to have transportation, all these things require enormous amounts of energy. Not to mention AI, which is obviously the next big wave of energy production, will all flow to that. And so it's necessary. There's no wealthy countries that don't have a large amount of energy. So GDP is highly correlated to energy production. Obviously, those variables are linked. It's complex, but you need a lot of energy. That's the takeaway. And so I see Bitcoin mining bringing energy to regions that otherwise wouldn't have the capital required to build out the energy assets. There's a company in Africa called Gridless, which I absolutely love, and they're deploying micro scale energy assets in rural areas in Africa and others, but a large part of their business is doing this. And they're essentially solving the last mile problem of energy production in Africa. So in the major cities, they usually have energy. It's not as reliable as the US, but they have some. If you get rural, there's absolutely no energy because it's cost prohibitive to generate the energy and or to transfer it long distances for such a small population center. And so they're essentially stuck, and there's no reason for them to have power because the incentives don't allow it. Enter Bitcoin mining, they can go dam up a tiny little river and create microgrids for local communities. And whatever the local community doesn't consume, the Bitcoin miners are happy to purchase. And so it essentially brings power to these rural areas. That gives them a chance to charge their cell phone, to learn online, to give their kids a better future, etc. And so I think energy around the world will be more widely distributed and it will find a home in areas that previously it couldn't. And so that's massively bullish for humanity. On the money side, I think Bitcoin is the native money of the internet. I think Jack Dorsey may have said that. And what that means is if you're living in a country with a less desirable currency, which is the vast majority of the world, you now have the opportunity to save the fruits of your labor in a fixed supply asset. And so while your local currency is being debased, you can now store your wealth in Bitcoin. And currently, what do they use? They store their wealth, if they can find them, in physical US dollars. Otherwise, most of the world, they store their wealth in goats, chickens, cows, cinder blocks, sun-baked bricks, tin, sheet metal for roofs, right? They try to find some commodity that stores wealth better than their local currency. And so they find those alternatives. But once the world realizes that Bitcoin's actually the best form of digital capital, I suspect those folks will have a much easier time saving for the future. And if you don't have any savings, it's very hard to take a risk. It's very hard to start a business. It's very hard to protect your family. And so it's good for the individual. It's good for the family. It's good for the community. It's good for countries. It's good for the corporations. It's good for everyone.
It also kind of dematerializes things. it's a side point that I just noticed, but like if you are no longer saving in real estate, for example, in Austria, a lot of people use real estate as their personal savings account. I don't know, probably a similar thing in America. I know in Australia and Canada is also like kind of a similar thing. That's why housing prices I keep rocketing, because people are keep buying them as their savings account and not just as a place to live. And Bitcoin kind of dematerializes those things and makes then the savings account way more like flexible in that regard. And I just love that. It makes like housing cheaper, and makes all the things cheaper, and it makes things really easier. I I have to ask, like, how is Bitcoin? I mean, it's unrelated to what I just said, like, but how do you compare Bitcoin to a mushroom? I've seen the article, and you I think you mentioned it in the intro.
Yeah, absolutely. So, quick note on the real estate side. Yeah, that's a profound point, which is that today it's hard to store your value long term. You can't use dollars, so you're essentially forced to invest your savings in order to maintain purchasing power and maybe even grow it. And so that leads to real estate, that leads to big tech stocks, that leads to fine art, all kinds of lesser stores of value. And then Bitcoin enters, and Bitcoin is just a superior way to store value compared to everything else.
Thank you for watching this video. This was only a snippet of the podcast. And if you want to watch the full episode and get all of the context of this episode, you can click right here or here. Oh, maybe also here.